Thanks very much, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about this project. I'm neither an expert on cancer or an expert on data, but I did play a bit of a role here in facilitating the project between ANZ and SAHMRI and the South Australian Academic Health Science and Translation Centre, and it turned out to be a really interesting and ongoing project. So I think highlights some of the things we heard in the first two talks. So colorectal cancer is one of the priorities of our translation centre, and the project that I'll be talking about is the Big Bowel Cancer Project, which has the ambitious target of utilising current knowledge to eliminate premature and preventable mortality from colorectal cancer. There's obviously a high burden of disease. It's the second leading cause of cancer death, but it is a disease we know a lot about. And it's a disease that we can detect early, and if detected early, we can prevent disease. But actually, interestingly, currently with screening, which we know works, only 40% of Australians participate in the screening project. And we know that if we could increase that up to 60 or 70%, we could actually halve the deaths to colon cancer, and colon cancer would then move from being the second most common cause of cancer death down with, amongst the leukemias and others, as a relatively uncommon cause of cancer death. But if we're going to do that, we need data, and we need that data to drive rational decisions about where we intervene. How do we increase fecal occult blood participation rates? How do we increase colonoscopy participation? What happens if we change the age of screening? What's the cost benefit of each of those scenarios? And really, again, it all goes back to data. So if we understand the evidence, then we can have the best policies and the best population-wide interventions. And our goal ultimately is to pilot these interventions across the whole of South Australia, population of about 1.5 million people, so it's a really good population to do this in. So the goal of the data analysis that we, the Translation Centre and our cancer people worked with ANZ on, was to look at population cancer registry data, that is overall incidence, mortality and survival by age and remoteness, Aboriginal status and so on, but also the clinical data, so the stage and grade, the radiotherapy, the clinicians, linking that to MBS and PDS, and also linking that to screening data. So there's a lot of data there, there's a lot of custodians of data, and there's a lot of linkage to do. So where's the project up to now? So we've done all the state data linkage, and SANT Data Link did that for us, and that they are in SAHMRI, and so that made that easy. And that certainly gave us a better insight into colorectal cancer survival in South Australia. And for instance, what we have observed already is that people under 50 have lower survival rates than people over 50, and this obviously goes to higher grade tumours, but also goes to screening, because screening is currently only utilised in over 50-year-olds. People over 80, again, had poorer outcomes, and again, this related to compromised resilience and poorer health status. We were quite happy to see, actually, that there was little variation according to socioeconomic status and residential remoteness, and that was quite an important finding. But we did find, and it's not on this slide, that the Indigenous population, again, had a worse outcome than the rest of the population. The ongoing plan is to link this with Commonwealth data, and that will then be within the Shaw environment at the Sachs Institute. And obviously, as I just mentioned, this linkage at a state level has already given us new insights into the burden of mortality, and we have approval for the Commonwealth data linkage. And once we link it to all Commonwealth data, I think that we'll even have a much much stronger set of data, and that data will then allow us to use that for population health system-wide responses and targeted interventions. And obviously we'll go on and publish that data. So that part of the project is working well. Data custodians, I think as you'll all have experienced, are a little slow in giving their permissions, but it's all working quite well. But then, and obviously the collaboration between ANZ and SAHMRI and the Translation Centre was part of the reason that went so well. But we were then challenged by ANZ, and they said to us, well, now you've done that, what about thinking about FAIR? Can you make this fair? And I know a number of people in the audience, because I know Tony didn't know what FAIR was, so I assume other people in the audience didn't know what FAIR was. And so FAIR means findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable. And this is what was discussed in the first talk, that a number of the major international journals, major international funders are talking about in terms of the data that we collect and the data that we then link and put into places like SURE. And so if we were able to make our data fair, then the data would not only be available for us in terms of the Big Bowel Cancer Project, available for us in terms of publication, but would be available to others to interrogate with other questions leading to other publications and other population health interventions. So how do we do that? So findable means minting a DOI or a digital object identifier and providing rich metadata data. So, and again, I think that was discussed in the last two talks, that you need to put it in a way that people can go in and find that data. Accessible, metadata will be made accessible through Research Data Australia, and the DOI will be resolved to a landing page, as an example, one that's maintained by the Translation Centre that people can go to and find. Interoperable means that you need to have your data assembled in a established method or standard language, has to be well described and basically linked to established investigator IDs, etc. So it needs to be in a way that other groups can come in, look at it easily and simply and utilise that data, and as I said, for the impact that we would expect it to be used for. The data needs to be accessible, and we would hope that this data would be accessible from within SURE, which is a safe data collection, to other researchers with appropriate ethics approval. And obviously reuse conditions would be provided to each research project that gains ethics and data custodian approvals to use the data collection via SURE. But as you can see at the top of the slide, this is a bit of an uncertain area, and I guess I'd ask you to put yourself in the position of either the researcher or the data custodian in giving these permissions. And so we all know how much work there is by the primary researcher in getting the data, getting the linkages, getting the approval from custodians, explaining why we're doing that, how that data will be released, etc., how the information will be released, etc., etc. Then we need to then put it into a storage system which is fair, which means that everyone else can get access to it, and obviously the data custodians, who are already a little bit sort of holding on to their data, are going to be a bit nervous about that. So I guess what we're learning in the challenge from ANZ in terms of fair data is that some of the technical stuff, or most of the technical stuff, can be achieved, but the accessibility and reusability is one that will challenge the Australian system and will challenge both our ethics committees and our custodians and our researchers in terms of getting there. And obviously we're not going to learn those lessons unless we try to get there. And I think that's why this project's been quite exciting. So the lessons that we've learnt have been more or less what I've just said, that in exploring making this data fair, we've really lots of challenges and questions about sensitive health data, multiple data custodians, and if you're doing data linkage, you could have up to 6 to 8 data custodians. And we're moving beyond the original project and the approved linkage project, so the data custodians obviously do need to be consulted. We don't know what the appetite for that is, but we're continuing to work down that path, and hopefully we'll be able to achieve that outcome that ANZ has asked us to try and achieve. And if we don't, then I think we'll identify what the obstacles to achieving that is, and we'll need to obviously have a conversation across Australia with data custodians, with ethics, and funders actually, to discuss how we make the Australian environment suitable for fair data. Just like to acknowledge that I did virtually none of that, and that David Roeder and Carolyn Miller from the BBC team did a lot of the work. From ANZ, there were a number of ANZ people involved. I've only put Keith there because he was the champion and still is the champion of FAIR at ANZ. But I would acknowledge all the other ANZ people that were involved. And this was done under the auspices of the South Australian Academic Health Science and Translation Centre. Thanks a lot.